Today on the Marketplace of Ideas, a conversation about that ultimate dictionary reader's challenge, the Oxford English Dictionary, with Ammon Shea, author of Reading the OED. Ammon Shea took on what is perhaps the dictionary reader's greatest challenge, all 21,730 pages of the Oxford English Dictionary. He's now condensed the experience in a book. It's called Reading the OED. Ammon, welcome to the program.
Great, thanks for having me.
I imagine that people will approach this book when they want to read it with a bit of a freak show feeling to it. They'll think of you as somebody who endured something for a long time, like a guy who sat on a bed of nails for a year. And I read the book and I was thinking to myself, maybe dictionary reading isn't all that uncommon. Did you find that it wasn't?
I feel that it's kind of odd, but it does seem to be uncommon.
It's uncommon. Okay, well,
believe it or not.
I'll use a different word. Maybe I didn't mean uncommon. Maybe I meant it's not unique to just you.
Well, there are other people I have met who do enjoy reading the dictionary. They tend to not read it from front to back. People a lot of times would say to me, I love reading the dictionary. I look up a word and I find myself browsing through it for an hour at a time. That was not at all uncommon. However, not too many people that I met said, yes, I started at A and I read through to Z, which I have to say was really kind of the most interesting part about it, was reading it all the way through. It's so much more enjoyable than I've always found dictionary reading to be terribly enjoyable, and it's really just, for me, the sense that you know that you're not really missing anything that's in there.
Now, in the jacket copy of the book, it says that you've been doing dictionary reading for the jacket copy says you've been doing it since you were 10, and in the book, in the main text, it says you've been doing it for 10 years. I don't know which of those is closer to the truth.
Well, there is a little bit of a discrepancy there, and what it is I grew up as a child reading. I liked reading the dictionary, but I would just kind of look at it, for an hour or two at a time. I think read through most of the Scrabble Player's Dictionary when I was a child because I was interested in playing Scrabble and whatever dictionary happened to be around. But about 10 or 12 years ago, I really started reading them from cover to cover in a kind of more methodical fashion. I just enjoy reading them as one might read any ordinary book that just happens to be long and alphabetized.
When you first started picking up dictionaries and actually starting from page 1 and going A through Z, did you think you'd actually be able to do it, to get through from A to Z all the way when you started?
Once I kind of got into it and read through the first several letters, like I said, it became apparent to me that it really was incredibly enjoyable. And as I've said, I think before in the book, it's kind of captivating in a way that any great book happens to be. There are words in there, and there's, especially in the Oxford English Dictionary, because so much of the OED is made up of citations from great literature that you're reading. There are 33,000 different quotations from Shakespeare in there. So you're reading most of Shakespeare, just chopped up, thrown into some kind of madcap blender, and then spat back out onto the pages. But you're still reading Shakespeare. And for me, Shakespeare is still wonderful writing, whether you're getting it one little phrase at a time or an entire book at a time. But it's the dictionary itself is full of all these great words.
Now, before I start asking about the OED itself, what was the first dictionary that you read through?
It was Webster's Second International.
Just for comparison, how big was that dictionary versus the size of the OED and the time required to get through it?
It's a large dictionary. I think it's 3,000 and change pages long. And it, oddly enough, it actually has more head words in the OED. It has about 475,000 words that it defines. The OED only defines about 300,000 words, but it defines them so much more thoroughly and with so many more literary examples that it's consequently 7 times as long as Webster's dictionary is. And I would say that took me, a few months to read through.
So when you're looking up one word in that dictionary and one word in the OED, the actual difference is then the OED includes more examples, or there's more etymology? Or?
Well, they have more examples of how the word was used. Like I said, Shakespeare comes up 33,000 times in the citations, but there are many, many other writers. There are tens of thousands of writers that they take advantage, use examples from. The OED is really it's a historical dictionary as well. So most dictionaries are just defining the words as they exist today or as they exist in the recent past. The OED, however, is trying to define the word not just how it is used today, but how it was used 100 years ago, and if it existed 500 years ago, what it meant then. They show all the different ways that it's been spelled throughout the ages and all the different ways that it's been used. So there was when they were first writing the OED in the late 19th century, there was a certain amount of conflict between the editors of the OED and the publishers, because the publishers wanted it to be 6 or 8 times as long as Webster's, and the editors of the OED kept on writing entries that were 10 or 12 times as long as Webster's. So it just kind of grew and grew and grew as time went on.
Is the OED in dictionary circles and dictionary enthusiast circles, is the OED sort of the ultimate one? Is that like the holy grail of dictionaries?
I think people have their own favorites. The OED is, I would say, it's pretty certain that it's received the most attention. It's received a huge amount of work, and it's obviously the largest. And many people, myself included, think that it's really, in most ways, the most scholarly. However, there are other people that prefer Webster's. There are some people that prefer other dictionaries, and it also depends on what it is that you're interested in looking for. If you're looking for a modern-day slang term, chances are you might not go to the OED first. If you're looking for something more historical or the broader sense of a word, then most people in dictionary circles would say, yes, it really is going to be the authority on that.
And this wasn't the first dictionary that you ever bought. Describe a little bit about your dictionary collection, even before you added the OED to it, what it looks like, how expansive it is.
To me, it's not that expensive, but that's just because I know some people who collect many, many more. I guess I have about 1,000, not dictionaries, but I have about 1,000 volumes of dictionaries and word books. I have a friend who collects she's been collecting for several decades, and she has about 20,000. So there are a few of us out there who really kind of collect dictionaries, but one of the things that's interesting about them is that there have been tens of thousands of dictionaries, or books about the language, books about words that have come out over the past several hundred years. The language itself is changing so much, and always changes, that the literature with which we describe it has to change as well, which makes it kind of an easy thing to then start collecting.
Now, as I understand it from your book, you and your friend, the dictionary dealer, you both live in New York City, where space doesn't come cheap. How do you store all these things?
It takes up all the wall space. And for me, I stopped collecting anything else. I got rid of most of my other books. And also, I moved in with my girlfriend last year, and she is herself a former lexicographer, so she didn't so much mind me bringing in 40 or 50 boxes of dictionaries.
So when did the decision come to purchase for yourself an OED?
I have about 7 copies of the OED, I guess. There are a lot of different editions of it. I had the 13-volume set that came out in 1933, and like a lot of people, I have the 2-volume set that's shrunk down, so there are 4 pages on each page, and a couple of other random editions of it. But it was when I first got the book deal to actually write this book that I went out and I bought the new 20-volume set.
Did it come together in your head like you wanted to order this new OED, and it would be a very good, not excuse necessarily, but a good reason and a good drive to read it all if you were writing a book about it?
Oh, it was a great excuse. I'd wanted to read the OED for years, but obviously it's something that's going to take a fair amount of time. Essentially, what I was trying to do is I went out and tried to find a publisher who would more or less subsidize my taking off a year or so from work to sit around and read the dictionary. And I very happily found that my current publisher, Perigee, was willing to do that.
What kind of shape did the book have in your head when you first got the idea? How did you know how it was going to turn out like it has today, or did you just have an idea, I want to write a book where I read the dictionary? I
didn't quite have so much of an idea, I would say. I had a guess that it would be more or less chronological as well as following the alphabet and form. But I more or less thought, well, I'd like to sit down and read the dictionary, and I'd like to talk about what, as I said before, for me, one of the most interesting things about reading the dictionary is this notion that I then will not have missed anything. I've always kind of been plagued by this thought that there are some really kind of interesting and wonderful words in the dictionary, and I'll never find them unless I sit down and read the whole thing. So I knew that would be a large part of it, was what I thought were the most interesting words that I came across as I read through it.
So this dictionary gets delivered to your apartment, and it's 21,000 pages, as we said. How many volumes? About 20?
20 volumes, yeah.
What is your lifestyle like while you're reading this thing?
Well, initially I was reading it at home, and then I found that it really was a bit too distracting to read at home. So even though I ordered the dictionary, and I do own this great 20-volume set, it's not the one that I read for the most part. I would go read at a library, and most of it I read in the basement of the Hunter College Library here in New York City. And so I would wake up in the morning and have a few cups of coffee, and then I would make a thermos of coffee to bring with me and go off to the library and more or less sit there in the basement for the next 8 or 10 hours and just read and drink coffee. And it was fairly distraction-free down there. So I was able to just allow myself to become completely wrapped up in reading what was essentially a great book.
Could you describe a little bit about the crowd that you encountered down there and saw day in and day out, what you call the library people?
Well, there are always library people at any library. One of the reasons I chose the basement of the Hunter College Library is that there aren't that many people, period. But anyone who's familiar with a large kind of public library, or I guess a small one, has come across library people. The people who really spend an inordinate amount of time there are the people who come to the microfilm room with shopping bags full of newspapers and such. And I think that I really turned into one of the library people. The folks that worked at the library kind of, would see me every morning. I was waiting outside the doors when it opened, and I was the last person to leave most days. And I think they had just a sneaking suspicion that I was just some kind of marginally odd member of society who had nowhere else to go. And that's why I spent all my days in the basement of their library.
Did you find that any of these dedicated library people were eventually looking at you like you were the weird one?
Yeah, I think they did, which is fine with me. I guess I brought that on myself, more or less.
So what's your schedule while you're doing this? Is it sun up till sundown you're reading?
Yeah, I guess I try to treat it more or less as a job, which was that I would get to the library when it opened at 9, and I would leave maybe at 6 or 7 in the evening. And I would spend the entirety of the day reading. And I have to say, it's really, I love to read, and again, reading the dictionaries for me was just as entertaining, if not more so, as reading a great novel. So it was a wonderful way to spend the day. I never felt like I was missing out on anything, and it never felt like it was any kind of drudgery to me.
Now, naturally, before this interview, I tried to read some dictionary pages myself, and the effect that I got while reading them is when you read all those definitions, you're always having to I was always having to reset my brain every time I got to a new definition, and it was kind of a herky-jerky feeling. How did you deal with that?
Well, I did get severe headaches for the first couple of weeks. So that it's not something, I guess, that really comes naturally. It's something that does take a little bit of getting used to. And some dictionaries are easier to read than others. And I also I got reading glasses, which does help quite a bit. But it's for me, there's a certain joy in reading a dictionary, and one of the things that I find most enjoyable about it is the fact that you're coming across all these words which are unusual or which are unknown to me previously. And it's not that I think big words are great to use in conversation. I'm not a huge fan of writers who use big words, but there's just something that's so pleasing about finding that there exists a word for something that you always thought, there must be a word for that. Like when I came across the word petrichor, which describes that wonderful smell when it first begins to rain, and that great warm, loamy smell that comes off the ground from the first rainfall of the day. I've thought for decades that there must be a word. It's such a great smell. Somebody must have come up with a word for that. And then you find that, there is in fact a word for it, petrichor. And it feels like it's just such a wonderful click that kind of goes in your brain. That's, for me, what really makes it interesting to read it.
What I found most interesting was the patterns that you noticed in the dictionary. I don't know if this counts so much as a pattern, but how you found that there are common words today for uncommon things, but for common things, the words are extremely rare and maybe not even there. Do you have any theory of why that might be?
I don't. But it is something remarkable that does seem kind of like a shame, like a word like atechny, which describes, a lack of art or, cacotechny, bad art. I don't know why that's such an uncommon word. It's so common to have bad art or lack of art. And so, I don't know why. I mean, a great example would be readless, which describes not knowing what to do in an emergency. Now, interestingly enough, the original meaning of savoir-faire, which is pretty common, is knowing what to do in an emergency. And I don't know why the uncommon concept with the common word survived, but not the reverse. Maybe some actual real lexicographer would have an idea why that is, but it's beyond me.
I imagine you gave a bit of thought to why any word gains traction, gains popular usage. Did you come up with anything insightful from this dictionary?
I didn't. In fact, I don't know why it is. I don't know why certain words have disappeared. For instance, one of my favorite words, for instance, it's not even in the OED, but it's in other English dictionaries, was epicaricacy, which was it was used maybe briefly in the 1700s, and the meaning of epicaricacy is exactly the same as the meaning of schadenfreude, the German word that we've imported recently. So I don't know why that word disappeared for hundreds of years. I mean, I'm sure that the notion of taking pleasure in someone else's misfortune never disappeared. That seems like a particularly human trait. I don't think it ever went away. I don't know why our word for it disappeared. I wish I had a theory for you, but I really just don't.
Did you see many glaring omissions of some of your favorite words in these 21,000 pages, or was that kind of an isolated incident?
No, there are occasional omissions. First of all, there is no such thing as a dictionary that has all the words in it. It's never happened before. It never will happen. And the OED was written over such a long period of time that they left out some words because they just either didn't exist or they weren't common. When it was first being written, in the late 1900s and late 1800s, there were some kind of well-known examples, such as appendicitis was left out, and it was left out because at the time it was thought to be a kind of uncommon medical term. And then I think it was Prince Edward or somebody, his coronation was delayed for several weeks because he came down with appendicitis, and suddenly everybody was saying, why doesn't the OED have appendicitis in it? And it's impossible for any dictionary, the OED included, to kind of decide, well, what this is going to be a common word in the future. All dictionaries are going to be kind of out of date. They're never going to always, judge this is going to be the word that will be very popular in 10 years. Let's put it in. There's some things that you come across that aren't in there, but for the most part, I would say it's really remarkably thorough. And
you mentioned also the one edition of the OED not having airplane because an airplane wasn't invented in the first volume, right, correctly, when the time was out?
Yeah, it was, I think that would have come out in the 1880s or something like that. The entry for airplane would have been before the 20th century, certainly.
When was the last revision of the OED? What's the most recent year that things were changed in the printed version, not the online version?
In the printed version, it was 1989, I believe, was the last. That was the year that the 20-volume set came out. I think they've printed a couple of volumes of editions, but the actual full second edition came out in 1989 in the 20-volume form. They do have the online OED now, which is currently being revised, so that's being updated. Every several months, they do a whole bunch of additions to that.
And you did some browsing in the book on the online OED, and you saw a few differences. Did you notice a whole lot of difference, or just kind of subtle?
Yeah, it's an enormous amount of differences. I mean, if you have the online capacity, if you can go to a library or some institution that has it, or if you just have the subscription yourself, you can look at a word as it's recently been defined, and you can compare it to the. They keep both of them, the old and the new versions. They keep them both current online. You can look at both at the same time. And it's really kind of stunning how much the book has changed as they go through it. For instance, I think one of the first words they redefined was make, which is enormously difficult. All the simple words are really hugely difficult to define. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of changes that they've made just to that one entry. It's really kind of, I can't imagine how much work it must have been for them to change all these things.
You talk about the entries for simple words being enormous, and it makes me think back to childhood about how we would look up, the in the dictionary, and that would be huge. I imagine the got quite a few column inches in the OED.
The did get quite a few. However, the largest one, at least in the print edition, is set. It took them about, I think, it's just over 60,000 words to actually properly define set.
60,000 words? That's a book.
Yeah, that's the length of a 200-page novel, somewhere around there. It's basically, it took them a John Grisham novel's worth of page to define just that one tiny little word. So it's one of the interesting things about dictionaries is that the big words are usually pretty easy to find, but it's the little simple words that are really incredibly difficult to get all the angles on.
A John Grisham novel seems to be a pretty common unit of word measurement for you. What was it? You said it was like reading a John Grisham book every day for you?
Yeah, I guess I don't have anything either for or against him as a unit of measurement. It's just I figured he's something that people are common with in terms of how long he is.
You're probably getting more enjoyment from the dictionary than the Grisham novel every day, though, I would imagine.
Yeah, I would say so.
Although, what sections of the dictionary were less enjoyable than whatever Grisham novel you could have picked up that day?
I believe, are the sections of words which begin with UN. I think it was about 450 pages or 451 pages long, and the overwhelming majority of those words are what the dictionary refers to as self-explanatory words, which means that they're so self-explanatory we really don't need to define them, which means that they're also terribly, terribly boring to read. And I had quite a bit of trouble making it through and I don't recommend it to anybody.
And you must have had an ironclad code of conduct because, I would have bent that a little to say I could skip the self-explanatory, but we weren't going to do that, right?
Well, I was tempted many, many times, but, every once in a while, I think I could skip all the unwords, and then suddenly you come across a word like undissonant, which is defined as making the sound of waves, which is just a really beautiful word, or unlove, which is the action of ceasing to love a person. Which is maybe not a beautiful word, but is potentially a very, very useful and descriptive one. So if you decide that you're going to skip any portion of the dictionary, at least for me, I knew that I would always be plagued by, the seeds of doubt that maybe there was something in there that I wish I had found, and that I would never know what it is.
That seems to be the repeating motivating factor for the whole project, is that you're afraid of missing something. So that's driving you to do a whole lot of stuff just because you don't want to miss whatever little thing, and it's a good impulse.
Yeah, and I learned early on that there was no way I was ever going to remember all of this, so I kept notes on everything. Anytime I came across a word that I thought was even mildly interesting, I just made sure I wrote it down. Because it is kind of difficult when you think, what was that word that I saw 2,000 pages ago, and you just can't remember it. There's no way to find it unless you kept track of it somehow.
And that brings me to the very next thing I wanted to talk about, which was the shape your notes took while you were taking them. How did you write them down? What did you do to get the relevant information that you wanted in the book down on paper?
Well, just like I said, anytime I saw any word that I thought was kind of interesting, I would just copy over the definition from the dictionary. And I would say over the course of it, I probably copied down maybe 10,000 different words in the book that I wrote. Maybe 500 of those are included. But yeah, anytime I saw anything that was of potential interest to me, even if it was a word that was, common, like one of the things that I also found really enjoyable about reading through the dictionary is not just the words that I never knew that existed, but also finding out all these new and interesting meanings of words that I did always know. For instance, the fact that one of the earliest meanings of the word secretary was literally just somebody who keeps a secret. It seems so obvious when you look at it on paper. Of course, a secretary is somebody who keeps a secret, but I'd never known that, and somehow it was just kind of made it a whole new way of looking at the word for me. So if I came across an unknown meaning of a common word, I would write that down as well.
When you read all these meanings that are now obscure today, did you find yourself later in conversation just hearing a word said and your mind went to the stranger meaning?
Yeah, sometimes. It's I think a mistaken belief that I used to have, and some people have, that reading a dictionary is going to improve your conversational abilities. I found that, if anything, as time went on, the more that I read, the more tongue-tied I would become, and the more I would trip over words and lose my train of thought. It just sometimes becomes so confusing when there's all these words are jumbled up in my head.
do you even get any conversational mileage out of just saying, hey, here's an obscure word you probably didn't know? I mean, that's pretty desperate sounding, but I'm sure.
Yeah, I try not to do that. I mean, as I said before, I think what's beautiful about these words is just the fact that they exist. And, you know, when I think of them, they make me think. I guess they make me more aware of certain things, like the fact that there's a word, ad vespery, which means to become evening or to turn into evening. I don't think that's going to be so useful for me to use in conversation because nobody really knows what the word means. And if I want to say, hey, look, it's advesperating, then suddenly the conversation stops so that the other person can say, what does that word mean? And then I can explain the word and then have this kind of broken conversation. And it's not helping me communicate. So it's really a useless word as far as communication goes. However, I find that when I'm aware of words myself, that I pay more attention to some of the things that they describe. So if there's a word like the oncoming of evening, I start paying more attention to it when it becomes dusk. Or if there's a word for the smell of rain wafting off the ground, I pay more attention to it when it first starts raining. So they're very private words in that sense, and I find that they're enriching for me, but not for their conversational worth.
And so learning the words then actually it enriched the concept itself that the word signifies for you, if not gave you a new word to use.
Right, exactly.
As I'm sure you saw, Nicholson Baker gave your book a very favorable review in the New York Times just a little while ago. And I thought to myself, Nicholson Baker is going to try to bring back all of these words himself. He's going to use them. That aside, about the notes you took while you were writing down these definitions, what did you have? You said you had about 10,000 definitions at the end. You had just a stack of them you'd written on paper?
Well, I picked up one of these great old 19th century ledgers. I guess it came from a general store somewhere. It was just an enormous book, about 500 pages, a foot and a half tall by a foot wide. And I just carried that around with me wherever I went, and I would just write down the words in there. So I got to keep all the words in one place.
And when you finished the dictionary, when you had these definitions all written down in this old notebook, how did you approach it to hack it down into a book?
Well, then I went back to the book and I started reading them, and I was then reading my own notes. And I had a handful of colored pencils, and I would keep kind of notes in the margins. If I thought a word was this kind of a word, it would get a little orange check next to it or a green circle around the word. So it turned into this kind of giant mess of colored pencil markings, notes, which half the times didn't even make any sense to me. But eventually I managed to cull them down into more or less my 500 favorite words or so.
And I was wondering about this. There have been a number of books where someone has done a thing for a year or read a big book out recently. I was thinking of, it made me think of A.J. Jacobs' book where he reads the entire Britannica. And I was wondering if with those books that have come out recently, is there anything that you've wanted to do or wanted to avoid doing just based on what you had seen come out, or had you seen them at all?
Well, I was aware of them. I hadn't read so many of them, and in all honesty, I even though I hadn't read A.J. Jacobs' book about reading the Encyclopedia Britannica, it did in some ways make me think, well, if somebody's willing to pay him to do that, maybe somebody would be willing to pay me to read the OED for a year. So you could say it was certainly inspiring in that sense. And the fact that it happened to take a year, it was not something that we aimed for at the beginning. My publisher at no point said, well, do you think you can do this project in 1 year? And it just more or less happened to be. Most book contracts, I think, tend to go along the lines of a year from when you sign it to when you deliver it. So that was more happenstance, I think, than anything else.
So it's certainly not a stunt book, really, unless you count reading the whole thing as a stunt itself.
Yeah, you could count that as a stunt itself. However, for me, it didn't feel like a stunt. It just felt like this is kind of what I enjoy doing, and this is typically what I enjoy reading, are dictionaries. So if there's a way that I can make a book from it, well, that's great.
So you came out with a big old notebook full of definitions you'd copied down. We talked about how "un" was the least interesting section. What were some of the most?
I would say P.
The entire letter P?
Well, P, all of it pretty much was pretty interesting, and P and R. There were certain sections like OB as well, certain prefixes. There are all these great words like obmutescence, which means it's the state of being obstinately quiet, or obganiate, which is to annoy somebody by repeating the same phrase, the same thing over and over again. I guess I did have favorite letters. And O, P, R were all great letters. C was a great letter. So much of our vocabulary is based in Latin and Greek that you can tell if you're coming across something like caco, which usually means bad in Latin and Greek, that there are going to be a lot of kind of interesting words about unpleasant people or unpleasant things in the caco section, like cacotechny, which is bad art, or cacozealous, which means just kind of unpleasant or badly imitating. So any of those prefixes I thought were really kind of exciting and interesting to read through. W was not my favorite section either. I think in part because there is no W in Latin, so W is entirely comprised of words. So not entirely, but almost entirely made up of words from Anglo-Saxon roots. It just wasn't quite as interesting to me.
You had a bit of a problem with X too, didn't you?
Yeah, X was not. I don't know why. I thought X was going to be a bit more of an interesting section, and it just wasn't that fun. I think it was only 12 or 13 pages long in the OED, and not so many really great words on there.
In the book, you describe how certain editors of the dictionary, their personalities will come through. Did you find a lot of that in the OED?
Yeah, especially the main editor of the OED. There have been a number of editors, but initially the main editor was James Murray, and in the first edition of the OED, he was probably responsible for at least, I'd say, half of the definitions or half of the entries. And every once in a while, you really get his personality coming through, and it's kind of wonderfully cranky and intelligent, erudite. Every once in a while, he gets a little waspish about something. He's really an absolute joy. His definitions are usually beautifully phrased. And, one of the things that is so enjoyable about reading, his work, but I guess the OED in general, is that I like to say I never picked it up and read it and came away feeling stupider. Reading through the OED, I always feel like I've come away with something which added to my understanding or feel for the language.
You find you come away stupider from other books?
Sure, I guess so. Or not necessarily from reading other books, but if I come away from doing some other activity, sometimes I don't feel like it's added to me. Watching TV or doing something else. Sometimes it just doesn't have quite the same effect on me as reading the dictionary does.
What sort of artifact would you see in the text of the OED that would let you know, oh, that's got to be good old James Murray?
Well, I think it was the entry for, it was PN, where he was complaining about the fact that we don't pronounce the P at the beginning of pneumonia or something. And he just had this kind of little note about it saying, it's really a shame that we don't pronounce it, diminishing the language. Which I don't necessarily agree with him, but I said he was a little bit cranky every once in a while.
It seems like that sort of old school flavor is a little more present in the OED than in any other dictionary. Is that a correct assumption?
In a way it is, and in a way it isn't. There are really, I guess, two schools of thought about this, which is that there's descriptivism, which is that dictionaries just describe the language, and then prescriptivism, which thinks that dictionaries should say how the language should be used. And I have to say, the OED is really pretty much in the first camp. They do not come across as saying we are an authority as to how you should use the language. They really do a wonderful job, though, of just saying this is how people do use the language. This is how the words of our language have been used. And they're, for the most part, they're really stunningly non-judgmental about it. They spend so much time listing every possible variant of a word, and they're not saying these words are misspelled. They're not saying they're wrong. They're just saying this is how it has been spelled. This is how it has been used. So they're really, like I said, they're kind of wonderfully non-judgmental about a lot of these.
Do you happen to know if the OED was then, as a result, ever the object of those cries about the end of Western civilization because they included the word beatnik or something like that?
Well, that was much more commonly applied to Webster's dictionary. In particular, it was Webster's Third International in 1961. Huge kerfluffle over that because they put in words like ain't, hopefully, things like that. A lot of people thought that was, like you said, signaling the end of Western civilization. I think the OED does get a fair number of letters asking them why they put certain words in. But I don't think they've really been subject to too much antagonism based on what they've put in.
The references you make in the book to the fact that people have written in, before you have, to correct mistakes, for example, and that there is a dictionary enthusiast community, I found that fascinating, but I also found fascinating that you were able to go to the Dictionary Society of North America conference. What did you find there?
I found there were not many people at the Dictionary Society of North America conference who were not actually working on dictionaries. There were me and one or two other people who were just fans. It was quite a bit of fun. I had a great time. I guess not so surprising given that I read dictionaries. But it was really just, there were about 100 lexicographers from all over the country and from all over the world, people who work on dictionaries of all sorts. And they more or less stand around for a couple of days giving papers and talks, having a conference about what the recent developments in dictionaries are. I understand some people might not find that so very exciting. I thought it was great. I got to meet a lot of people who've worked on dictionaries that I've been reading for years and really kind of admire. And I think, one of the things that kind of ties into what we said before, a lot of people, I think, don't necessarily understand what it is that lexicographers do, or, as I said, how much effort they put into things which are not really appreciated. For instance, the fact that they spend so much time and effort on defining things that people don't really ever look up, or don't look up that often. Like, I think, not so many people say, I don't really understand what the means. I'm going to go look it up in the dictionary. They might look at it, but that's not what they own a dictionary for. And that's such a huge amount of a lexicographer's effort goes into treating this part of the language. And then I think it's, almost a shame that people don't really spend a corresponding amount of time looking into what they've done with it.
Can a lexicographer's career be spent entirely on these words like the, just getting them nailed down as correctly as possible in a dictionary?
I guess they could, I don't know if they do, in fact, or not. I think they tend to be more generalists and kind of work on the whole language. I think you would have to be kind of mad to spend your whole life working on little words. But who knows? Maybe there is somebody who has done nothing but that.
I really have to ask it because just the amount of time we've spent talking about how lexicographers will nail down precise meanings. Have you ever tried to make a jump to reading philosophy of language at all?
I have not. And I do know some philosophers of language, and I've heard them talk, and sometimes I've tried reading, I guess, but it kind of escapes me.
It doesn't have the appeal a dictionary does for you?
No, it doesn't have quite the same appeal. And I think for me, what it is that so much of what I find in the dictionary, it's evocative, or it's almost nostalgic in a way. I mean, one example that I tend to give people is that people they frequently say, well, isn't it boring reading the dictionary, or how can the dictionary possibly be emotional? And my answer is typically if you come across a word like remord, and the remord has two different meanings, and one, it means, as a noun, it means a touch of regret, or as a verb, it means to remember something with regret. And for me, when I come across a word like that, talking about remembering something with regret, and it's such an unusual word, and it was a word that I'd never seen before, and it was instantly and tremendously evocative for me. I found it impossible to come across a word like that and not have it bring forth things that I myself regretted, or thinking about the things that I regretted. And there are so many words like that the words themselves can draw forth things which you just hadn't thought about because you didn't know there was a word for that. When you find that this word exists, it makes you then think of the thing that it describes. And that, for me, I think it's kind of highly individual. There are certain words in the dictionary that really strike me and impress me in a way that's, again, emotional, a way that they might not be for somebody else. So it's a personal experience reading the dictionary. It's personally evocative based on my own life history. That's not something that I ever got from reading, I guess, philosophy of language.
One of the words that seems to have really struck a chord with you, actually, I think there were two words meaning this, but two words you found in the OED that meant someone who laughs excessively. You seem to really hate those people.
Yeah, as I laugh myself. Well, it's the main one I think that you're referring to is a cachinnator, which is a person who not just laughs too much, but sometimes a person who laughs too loud. Yeah, I'm not a real big fan of cachinators. And I think there's also a hypergelast. Hypergelist or hypergelastic is another word for somebody who laughs too much. They're not my favorite people in the world.
You've had to make up the pronunciations yourself for a few of these words, right? Because no one knows.
Yeah, a number of these words they have been used, or the OED themselves took them out of dictionaries from the 1700s, which predated pronunciation guides. Have not, to my knowledge, been spoken since then. So I guess, given that the OED didn't know how to pronounce them, they just put them in and had no pronunciation guide. So I didn't want to. I have to say I'm absolutely horrible at pronouncing words. So I have a miserable grasp of correct pronunciation. I embarrass myself constantly when I try to say these words out loud. So I just didn't have a pronunciation guide at all for them.
In your book, you talk about finding a certain narrative in the OED, and what do you mean by that? You refer to it as a story as well, as a great story.
Well, again, it's, I've heard it said that, the entirety of Hamlet is in the OED. It's chopped up and then put back in, alphabetized based on the words that it's describing, or that it's words that the citations are for. So there is a narrative arc in that there are more of a certain kind of word at a certain place and more of a certain kind of word at another place. As I said before, W, there are no words of Anglo. And words are all of Anglo-Saxon origin. There are no words of Latin. In a section like, it begins with CACO, you're going to get words of a very specific flavor. And so I guess just for me that this kind of gave each section more of a feel. There were certain sections where you would really come across much more Shakespeare as opposed to other sections. As I said before, even one line of Shakespeare is still Shakespearean. It still can draw forth some real kind of feeling in terms of what it's about. So it's not quite a logical narrative, perhaps, but there is still a narrative. It's just as long as you allow yourself to not get too wrapped up in whether it makes sense or not, you can really get an enormous amount of feeling from whatever words are kind of coming by you on the page.
In his guide to Shakespeare, Isaac Asimov writes something like, the English language slowed down after Shakespeare in terms of changing because it would be out of fear that Shakespeare would one day become incomprehensible. How much validity would you give that whole guess? I'm not sure, and this is where I start, making protestations with the fact that I'm not a scholar of the language or anything like that. One thing that I do think comes up more often than it should is there are an enormous number of words in the OED for which Shakespeare is the first cited author. And people like to say, well, that's, because Shakespeare invented all these words. And he did invent probably a large number of words, but it's also because Shakespeare is the most studied author in the English language. And he's probably one of the most read authors in the English language. So people really spend a lot more time paying attention to his language that he used. So I think it's possible that he existed at a state point in the language where there are a lot of new words coming up. Maybe he contributed a lot of these words, and I think it's also possible that subsequent scholars of the language have spent an enormous amount of time paying a lot of attention to what Shakespeare was doing with the language, and so maybe it's a little unfairly weighted towards him. Do you know if any other languages besides English have a book like the OED, just something so expansive, so huge, so historical?
Oh, sure, yeah. There's a number of them. I think there's a dictionary of Dutch, which is up to 40 volumes now. The The French have a number of exceedingly large dictionaries. The Germans worked on an enormous historical dictionary. I think it took them about 140 years, 160 years. So it's not the only dictionary of this size or of this depth in the world. It is certainly the most comprehensive one in English, but not in the world.
Some people will talk about the English language having so many words. They'll sometimes say it has too many, in fact. But would that mean that other languages have outworded English at this point, or just they have longer dictionaries? Or
no, I mean the size of the dictionary is not necessarily indicative of how many words are defined in it. As I said before, the OED is in the print version, it's almost 22,000 pages, and they define 300,000 words. There have been other dictionaries like Webster's Dictionary, Webster's Second, which was 18,000 pages shorter or something like that, and actually defined more words in it. So the size of the dictionary just doesn't necessarily correspond to how many words. That being said, my understanding is that English does have a significantly larger vocabulary than other languages in general. I think maybe French or Russian have, I'm sure I'm not being exact here, but I think there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 150,000 words. And, again, there have been plenty of people who have counted 500,000, 600,000 words in English, more or less.
What could you find you could learn about the English language itself from reading the OED, other than that there's a lot of words to it, or maybe why there's so many words?
I think everybody can learn something, but for me, one of the things that was most striking was that there are so many words for things, which it seems odd that there is a word for that. That I would frequently find myself thinking, wondering why we need a word for that. Doesn't mean that I'm against the word, but for instance, there's a word like apricity, which describes the warmth of the sun in the wintertime. And I doubt many people ever kind of thought to themselves, we really need a word to describe the warmth of the sun in February. And I can't believe we don't have a word for this. There's that, but what it really leads me to is the fact that it's such a marvelously descriptive language. And then for instance, there are other words like avidulous, which describes being somewhat greedy. So it's not terribly greedy, and it's not hardly greedy. It's just kind of middle-of-the-road greediness.
Acceptable greediness.
Right, that's what I like to think of it as, acceptably greedy. So there are things which are so remarkably specific in our language in terms of what they can describe. And, for instance, another great example is Bayard, or B-A-Y-A-R-D, which describes a person who is armed with the self-confidence of ignorance. And you can't really get much more descriptive than that as an insult. And I'm sure we can all think of people we would like to just put that word to. But that to me is one of the most striking things about a vocabulary. It's not just how large it is, but how beautifully specific it can be.
In all of the short bios I've read of you, it describes a series of not necessarily strange-sounding jobs, but unusual-sounding ones for somebody who reads dictionaries. They describe it being a gondolier, being a sax player in Paris, and so on and so forth, being a furniture mover. Were you reading dictionaries while doing all that stuff?
Yeah, most of it. All the jobs that I've had in the last 10 or 12 years, which would include being a furniture mover in New York and a gondolier in San Diego. Believe it or not, reading dictionaries is not the most financially rewarding occupation in the world. I know many people have trouble with that notion, but it does happen to be true. As I like to say about it previously, reading books about obscure words has been so financially rewarding. It's allowed me to pursue my lifelong dream of manual labor, which is one of the reasons why I've been a furniture mover for most of my life. So they may seem like they're an odd combination at times, but they do in fact complement each other in an acceptable way.
And as the end of the book says, you're reading the OED again. How far are you into it?
Well, I haven't gotten around to reading it in order yet. What I've been doing lately is comparing a number of my favorite words between in terms of what the printed book has, and then the online version that has, as I said before, is being edited now. So I'm kind of spending a lot of time comparing the new version with what is now the old version. And that is not being done in order so much. A lot of what they're editing now are the words which people most commonly look up. So I'm spending a fair amount of time looking into that.
Are you finding anything terribly fascinating in that comparison?
Yeah, I guess before, the amount that the language changes is endlessly fascinating to me. Some of these things, some of the entries that you find in the OED now, some of the print entries, they haven't been edited for 100, 120 years. So it seems not that surprising that a word from 1908 is strikingly different than a word in 2008. But a lot of the words which seem kind of common are, I don't know how many examples I can draw off the top of my head, but just the amount that the language will shift and meanings will change over the course of 50 or 20 or 100 years is really kind of interesting.
You describe yourself in the book as a man who loves to read, and I want to know what do you enjoy reading when you're not reading a dictionary?
Oh, anything. Fiction, nonfiction, travel writing, memoirs, biography, books about history, big history, little history, pretty much anything. I'm a big fan of Nicholson Baker. I was thrilled when he wrote the review. There's very little that I do not enjoy reading.
Is the dictionary a vector for you to find books as well?
Sometimes it is. I ended up reading a lot more Rabelais and Urquhart, and there were certain parts of Shakespeare that I would really kind of get drawn to, or certain poets that I really loved. I ended up reading more Ogden Nash after going and finding him in the OED. More Lewis Carroll, more Alice Munro. Every once in a while there would just be a line from an author that would kind of leap out at me, and I would say, that's a great line. I'd like to see the rest of that book. And I tried to avoid kind of getting distracted that way as I was trying to read straight through. If you stop and investigate every book that looks interesting as you're reading, I just realized I never would have finished. But since finishing reading it, I've kind of allowed myself a lot more time to go and read more stuff that my interest was piqued about.
In the late chapter in your book, you actually endorse the OED. You say you should go read the OED. Why should someone who is not already a dictionary lover go read the OED?
I don't know that I would say you should go and sit down and read the whole thing from cover to cover. That might be a bit excessive. What I was really, I guess, trying to get at is that there is so much information in the dictionary, and there is such an extravagance of information, and so little of it is in fact used. It seems to me that most people use the dictionary for very small, specific purposes, such as seeing if they're spelling a word right, or if they actually did lose that challenge in that round of Scrabble. Does egregious mean what I think it means? And these are all great things to use a dictionary for, but there's such a small amount of what's in the dictionary. It seems such a shame that we use the dictionary for so little of its actual potential. It's, to me, almost like taking a great novel like War and Peace or Dostoevsky and using it as a paperweight. Sure, it does work as a paperweight. It's heavy and it's compact, and it will keep your papers from flying off the desk. But it's so much more than that. There's so much wonderful examples of humanity and pathos and tragedy and comedy in these books that you think, well, you should read the book. It's great. It's got all this wonderful stuff in there. And I feel the same way about a dictionary. It's got so much of the human condition in it that it seems a terrible shame to use it for school reports and checking to see whether you misspelled a letter.
In the very end, after the main text of your book is over, there's actually an advertisement for the OED. Do you know if you've caused a spike in purchases of the print OED?
I don't know if I have.
If you did, would you get a cut?
No, I would not.
One last thing I want to know from you is when you finished the book, you turned the manuscript in. Was it right back to moving furniture for you?
Oh, no, I have not yet returned to being a mover.
How long do you think it'll be before you pick up another couch?
I hope it will be some time. I spent most of my life, intermittently at least, being a mover. And I grew up in a moving company, and I had been doing it since I was was 8 years old, and I would prefer to not return to that particular profession. So I'm working on a different book now, which is still somewhat related to this, but in a different area, and I hope to continue that as a vocation, not as an avocation.
Any preview you can give us of it?
It's more or less in brief, a history of the changes in the common books in our life: phone books, dictionaries, Sears Roebuck catalog, encyclopedias, etc.
Are there a lot of changes, or are they small things that you wouldn't necessarily notice?
Well, I don't know. I think it depends. I mean, some of them are huge changes. For instance, the fact that nobody uses the phone book anymore. It's just gone. And it used to be, at least when I was a kid, it was a big part of everybody's life, My parents still have one. Their phone sits on a little piece of furniture that's made to hold a phone book. And nobody uses them, period. I guess catalogs are in some ways a big part of our lives. The Sears Roebuck catalog had an enormous influence on how certain parts of America developed and the fact that they were able to. And it went from being a great, important part of people's lives to now catalogs are just all the junk that we throw away 5 o'clock when we come home from work and get the mail. So I guess some of them are changing. Maybe I haven't really worked out the book yet, but that's what it is so far.
I look forward to it. Ammon, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
For more information on Ammon Shea, visit ammonshea.com. That's AMMONSHEA. Our music is composed by Ben Althouse. Check out his website, Ben Althouse, that's BENALTHOUSE.com. For more information and our online show archive, visit colinmarshallradio.com.